Hi, I'm Vicky from Rockstars and Royalty. In this series I'm going to show you how I turn this sketch into a gown, how I make the accessories to go with it, and how I style the whole look. This is a really rough design that I sketched when I saw the fabric online and just fell in love with it. The dress is corseted, so it's got a corset top, it's got a full skirt over a petticoat, it's going to be really heavily embellished with flowers and beads, and it's got long tulle cape sleeves. The flowers to me represent spring and awakening. To go with it, I'm going to make a gold headpiece, which to me represents the sun and a new day. I'll also be embellishing a pair of shoes to go with it as well. So to make this gown, I have cream lining fabric. I've got a rich cream satin. I'm then going to layer over it with these beautiful clear sequins that will just sparkle through the tulle. And then this is the floral tulle layer that will form the top of the skirt and the corset. I've got ivory tulle that I'll make the cape sleeves from. And to embellish it, I've got a selection of leaf and flower appliques in reds and pinks. I've got these chiffon flowers in 3 different colours. I've got red ribbon to lace the corset up with. And I've got a selection of crystals and beads to add on top of the embellishments after they're sewn on. To finish the look, I've got this beautiful rose gold wig which I'll be styling. I'll be making the gold sunrise headpiece, and I'll also be embellishing a pair of shoes. This is the petticoat that I'm going to be using underneath this dress. It's got 3 hoops in it with a little bit of net over the top. I tend to buy my petticoats rather than make them because they're pretty cheap to buy and they're quite fiddly and time consuming to make. As I work on my own here, I'd rather spend my time making dresses than making petticoats, so I do buy them, but often I will alter them just to change the length if necessary. Make sure you check out my weekly vlogs. I go into more details with everything that I'm doing with each step of this dress in those and give you a look behind the scenes at my business and my life as well. I'll put links in the description, and there'll also be a playlist with all of the Flora dress videos in. I'm going to use my standard size 12 corset pattern as a starting point for this. I'm going to cut out a really quick toile in calico. I'm not going to bone it or anything. I'm just going to whip up a quick toile and pop it onto the dress form and see what I need to change. So this is my toile pinned onto my dress form. Because it doesn't really fit on here, I've just padded out one hip and a little bit in the bust, just roughly. I've made this pattern so many times. I know what it looks like when it's made up, and I know how it fits when it's made up, so I can see, even though it's sort of baggy and not boned, I can see exactly what I want to change for this dress. I'm just going to shorten it at the top of the side front seam and bring the V lower. So this is my cut edge, so my finished edge will be even lower than that again. I want my finished edge at the bottom to stop at the same height all the way around, so it'll be a straight line here, which is quite close below the waist, and that will give us a really nice flow from the bottom of the corset out into the fullness of the skirt. And I'm just going to take it in a little bit at the waist there, just to really exaggerate the curve when it's on. So I've remade my paper pattern with all the changes from the toile that I put onto the dress form before, and then I've used my new pattern to cut out 2 lots of satin. So I've interfaced the satin with a really fine iron-on interfacing just to give it a little bit of extra strength, and then I've cut out one set which will be the lining of the corset and another set which will be the outside of the corset. The next job to do is to tack 2 layers of calico, which is my strength layer, onto the lining pieces, and the boning will then go between the 2 layers of calico once it's all together, and I'm going to tack sequins onto the outside of the outside layer. So here's the first piece of the lining. So we've got the satin, which will be the very inside of the corset. Then we've got the double layer of calico, which will form the middle of the corset, and the steel boning will slide in between those 2 layers once I've got it all stitched and the bone casings in there. Next, I'm tacking the outside layer of the corset satin side down onto the back of the sequin fabric. So once it's tacked and cut out, it's going to look like that. I keep separate scissors just for cutting sequin fabric, because cutting sequins will trash your scissors. These are IKEA ones. I think they're about $10 a pair here in Australia. So I buy them and use those for sequins. And when they're no good anymore, I move them on to be for paper or something like that, and then move on to the next pair. But they last me a good couple of years before I need to retire them. My outside layer now has sequins tacked onto every piece, and my lining layer has a double layer of calico tacked onto every piece. I've got my brand labels, my size label, and my hanging ribbons ready to sew in, and I'm going to start by working on the lining. I'm going to be using 5mm spiral steel boning and 6mm straight steel boning to bone this corset. As I stitch the lining together, I'm going to stitch in the bone casings for where these need to go. I'm going to start with my centre front piece, and I'm going to stitch 1, 2, 3, 4 bone casings into this before I join the side fronts on. This will be spiral steels at the front because we want it to curve still. So that's my 4 bone casings sewn into my front panel. Next I'm going to pin my side front pieces on. Then once they're joined together and stitched open, I'm going to trim away the excess seam allowance and stitch a bone casing along this side of the seam, and then stitch either 1 or 2 bone casings in the centre of the side front panels. So this is my front and side front of the corset lining all joined together. So you can see with the seam stitched open, it gives a really neat finish. And then I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 bone casings sewn on each side at the minute, which will have the spiral steel boning in and will give really good support up over the bust, up the side of the bust as well. So now I'm going to carry on, and I'm going to join the side back and the back panels on in exactly the same way. I'm going to stitch the seam allowance, stitch them open, stitch the bone casings, and then stitch the next panel on till I get to the back. I'm also going to add my hanging loops in my side seam, and then I'm going to sew on my brand labels and my size labels into the lining at this stage as well. This is a finished lining with all the boning channels sewn in. I've got my hanging loops in the side seam, and I've got my label in the back, and I've trimmed away all of the excess from the seam allowances on the inside. Next I'm going to sew all the pieces of my sequin layer together and then clip the seams and press them open. This is the outside layer all together, and I've pressed the seams open on the inside. Now that my lining and outside are together, I've cut 2 pieces of satin on the bias, and I've ironed them in half with the right sides facing out, and I've pinned it onto the top of the outside of the corset around 2 centimeters from the edge. Once it's all joined together, this will be a little strip that will stand up at the top of the corset, and it will help prevent the sequins rubbing underarm. After I've pinned it, I've tacked it into place so it doesn't move as I sew the lining and the outside together, and I've just trimmed the ends off so you can sort of see how it curves up towards the side front seam and towards the centre back. Next I'm going to pin the lining and the outside together, right sides together, just along the top for now. Next I'm going to stitch all the way along the top, 1.5 centimeters down, which is my seam allowance, and I'm going to stop 1.5 centimeters from either end. I'm then going to trim my excess and understitch it, and I'll stop my understitching around there so that I can turn it back again and join the centre back seam. So it's stitched right sides together, and I've graded and clipped my seam allowances. So next I'm going to open it up and then understitch all of that seam allowance towards the lining side. my understitching done. I've taken the tacking out of there so you can see how, once that's in the right way, you can see how that satin sits up above the top seam, and that just stops that top of those sequins rubbing. So next I'm going to put it back right sides together and stitch down my back seams. I've stitched and graded my centre back seams and I've cut the corners off, so next I can turn it in the right way. I've got it in the right way and I've just pinned down the back and all the way along the top, and this is how it's looking. Next I'm going to use spiral steel in all of the bone casings except the two back ones either side, which are either side of the grommets, which I'm going to use straight steel for. I tip my boning with electrical tape. I hate those little U-shaped metal things. I find them really fiddly to put on. I find they pop off and they're lumpy as well and can show through. So I've tried shrink tubing, I've tried the metal U-chips, and I just use electrical tape. It's enough to stop the ends of the boning coming through if you cut it with the method that I'm about to show you. And it's really, really flat, so it's not adding extra bulk inside those bone casings. If anyone's got a better method that keeps it looking really flat, that's not shrink tubing or those U-tips, let me know. I'd love to know what you use to tip your metal boning with. So before I put it in, I'm just going to show you how I cut it. So to cut it, I use these wire cutters. All you need to do is clip that wire on the side, so the widest point, and then clip the one in next to it afterwards, and that cuts through and it gives you a really neat end. And then you can just use your pliers. So there's just one sharp bit, that sharp bit's pointing downwards, so there's just one sharp bit pointing up. I can just use a pair of pliers just to sort of angle that in a little bit. It's hard to do reaching around the camera. So then I wrap one piece of tape over the end. Remember the sharp bit sort of down the side there. And then I take another piece and stick it on and wrap it around. The sharp bit's then encased completely within that tape. Nothing's going to come out the end because it's just a millimetre or so longer than the metal. And it's added, this is the bit that I love about using tape, is that it's added absolutely no width to it there. I've never had any problems with dry cleaning or anything like that. I've never had a problem with the glue on the tape causing problems. I can use white tape or black tape depending on what I'm making and what's not going to show through. And I find this gives me a really neat end and it stays on. It's not going to fall off in your casing as you're putting bones in and out. It's a really neat, easy way and cheap way to finish the ends of boning, and I use exactly the same method on my straight steel boning. So to bone each boning channel, I'm going to measure and mark 2 centimetres up from the bottom. So 1.5 centimetres is our seam allowance where we're going to be joining the skirt on. So by stopping the boning 0.5 centimetre higher than that, I'm not going to run the risk of hitting the steel with my needle as I sew the skirt onto the bottom of the corset. I then put my tipped piece of steel in between the correct layers. I push it up as far as it will go. Then I kind of put my thumb where it needs to be and I keep my thumb in the right place as I pull it out. And then I cut it to the right length and tip this end with my tape. Push it up nice and tight into my boning channel, but not so tight that it buckles. You want it to be the right length. And then I'm going to pin it in place. So I'm going to go ahead and do all of these. Pin them in place, then I'm going to stitch just through the lining layers to hold the bones in place. And I'm going to do exactly the same for the 2 either side at the back, but I'm going to use straight steel boning, which I cut with a hacksaw. So I've got all the boning in and I've stitched it into place, but only stitching through the lining layer. So the last job to do now is to line up the bottoms and just stitch along the bottom to hold all the layers together. If you're just making a plain corset, at this point you'd put your eyelets in as well, but because we're going to be decorating it, I'm going to do those at the end after we've got all the embellishments on. So I'm just going to pin all the way along the bottom, stitch it below probably about 1 centimetre because the skirt will be sewn on 1.5 centimetres up, so I'll stitch about 1 centimetre from the edge. The boning's all sewn in and I've joined it together along the bottom, so that's how it looks on the outside. So all of our top and back are really neatly finished. This seam here will be between the skirt layers once we join the skirt on. And then on the inside, you can see where I've stitched the boning into place. And by the time the skirt's sewn on, it will be above this line of stitching here, and we'll butt right up to that, so it'll be really neat. So here's how the finished corset looks. So I've popped it onto the mannequin so you can get an idea of how it looks, even though it is too big. So you can see the nice curve that we're going to get through into the hips from the waist once it's actually on a person rather than a dress form. You can see we've got a really nice curve over the bust. The weight of the skirt's going to help to just get this sitting even nicer, but the boning's already doing its job to hold it in place. And there's the back. It's overlapped a bit at the minute, but we've got the two pieces of boning there, and the eyelets will eventually go between them. In part 2, I'll be showing you how I make the skirt and attach it to the corset and how I hem it.